I just finished the Master's in Environmental Studies program at Evergreen, and what I wanted to look at for my thesis was local level climate policy, kind of as illustrated by Seattle. Research question for this is, does Seattle's experience demonstrate that making climate policy at the local level is a good idea? And to give you some background on this, I am going to have to go into economics for just a second, I apologize, but what we look at with the atmosphere is it's what economists call a common property resource, and that means that you can't exclude certain users. So you can't say, your emissions are going to go here, my emissions are going to go here, when this part is full, you can't have any more emissions. And so the idea with common property resources, according to economic theory, is that they're always going to be overexploited because everybody's just going to try to use as much as they can before everybody else takes all the capacity. And so you wouldn't expect smaller users like cities, like NGOs, that kind of thing, to be limiting their emissions because that would put them at a disadvantage to other users who are choosing not to do that. But what we see instead is that all over the world, in developed and developing countries, everywhere, cities are making climate policy. They're reducing their emissions, they're looking at adaptation, all these kinds of things. So I wanted to look at what is happening there, why they're doing that, is it effective, and I wanted to use Seattle as kind of a case study to illustrate that. What I found was that it is a good idea as part of a global multi-scale climate policy. In terms of existing research, it fits more or less into two categories. There's some theoretical research that looks primarily at what cities can do politically, legally, socially, and that looks mostly at what they could do to reduce emissions. Practical research looks a lot more at what threats cities might face, and that tends to focus a little bit more on adaptation actions. In both of those, there's not a lot of research in the area. What there is primarily case studies, which is what I did. I'm going to talk about why that is. I did a case study. It would be really great, to be able to have an experimental Seattle and a control Seattle and, play policy God and do whatever you want. I can't do that. I do vote, but that's all the influence that I have on Seattle's climate policy. And a lot of what I'm looking at happened in the past, too, so I can't influence that at all. Case studies are also good for integrating a lot of different kinds of data. I was looking at emissions inventories, I was looking at policy documents, meeting notes, interviews, blog posts. I need to be able to put all that together. And so what I did, I looked at a lot of the background literature, and I asked, what is the process that the literature is describing? Is Seattle following this process? Does it look like researchers are on the right track, or do they kind of need to back up and reevaluate what they're looking at? And just for a little bit of context on local climate policy, in 1990, Toronto was one of the first cities to really get into this. They, all the way back then, they implemented emissions reduction targets. Cities generally start with municipal operations, so making city buildings more efficient, switching their fleets to hybrid cars, that kind of thing. And once that's established, they can move on to more community activities. And they can take 4 different roles. They can take a direct and enabling, providing, and regulating. Direct is, like I was just saying, reducing emissions from their own activities. Enabling is sort of creating space for other actors to reduce their emissions. Providing is providing resources for those actors. And then regulating is actually starting to implement things like, requiring certain efficiency levels in building codes, requiring streets to have bike lanes, that kind of thing. So for Seattle, just a little bit of background here. In 1992, the city passed a resolution affirming that climate change is real and saying that the city needed to reduce emissions. In 2000, they set the goal of having the first carbon-neutral municipal electric utility. 2005 was a big year. Seattle City Light achieved carbon neutrality. The city developed and published its first climate action plan, and then the mayor at the time was Greg Nichols. He got really frustrated with the federal government's failure to sign on to Kyoto, so he started the U.S. Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement, where participating mayors would agree to try to get their cities down to the goal that the Kyoto Protocol set, and that would be getting their emissions down to 7% below 1990 levels by 2012. So Seattle actually achieved that goal in 2008. In 2012, just this past year, the City Council passed a resolution committing it to carbon neutrality by 2050. And that, just to be clear, that is the whole city, not just municipal operations, but all activities within what the city considers its area of influence. This year, the city published its second climate action plan, And it's working on an emissions inventory for 2012 to see if it maintained that 7% reduction, given that the city has actually grown quite a bit since 2008. So for data, there were two kinds of inventories that I looked at. The really important ones are these community inventories, and those look at all activities within the city borders. I mean, the city has those from 2005, 2008, and they're working on the one for 2012. And 2008 also includes a retroactive inventory of 1990 to give them that Kyoto Protocol baseline. There's also municipal inventories. They have those for more years because those are easier. Those are just city activities, so it's easier for the city to measure those on a regular basis. And then there were two main policy documents that I looked at. The first one is the city's climate action plan. And what you see there, there's two prongs to it. There's obviously the emissions reduction thing. And that, with the carbon neutrality for 2050, that kind of thing. And there's also a fairly significant adaptation portion, which is something that I didn't expect as much coming in from the literature, because a lot of the academic research is still separating mitigation and adaptation. And the city isn't doing that so much. And this climate action plan also talks about the reasons that Seattle is addressing climate change. And so there's some more sort of like emotional reasons, I don't want to say emotional, but kind of where the city has a strong environmental background. It feels very strongly about its place in the Pacific Northwest, about its environment, but that doesn't necessarily make policy. And what is happening actually is that they see a lot of co-benefits from these policies. So for instance, increasing, say, public transportation is going to reduce traffic, which is kind of a serious problem right now. Getting a more flexible electric grid with small renewable energy projects will reduce emissions. It will also help the city with its adaptation goals because that gives it more flexibility in the event of extreme weather events. Improving city infrastructure is always a good idea. So the other thing I wanted to look at too is in a lot of cities you'll see that you've got climate policy over here and you've got the rest of the city over here. And climate policy is always struggling for funds, it's struggling for personnel, so I wanted to see how that is integrated in Seattle's policy. And if you look at the city's comprehensive plan, which I don't necessarily recommend because it's about 250 pages long, but if you do, and you look for the environmental section, you'll notice that it's only maybe 20, 30 pages long, and that seems kind of weird. Until you start looking at the whole thing, and you'll see that every single section is focusing on sustainability along with the city's other core goals. So for instance, in its neighborhood plans, it has this strategy it's calling urban villages, where it wants to set up these areas that are high density, accessible by public transportation so people can live and work and access services without having to drive. And that's, every single neighborhood they have a plan for where they want to put these urban villages and how they want to integrate that in with all the other departments like transportation that they need to have to make those work. So for my analysis, I wanted to look at real quick if the city has actually reduced its emissions. So I reviewed the emissions inventories to make sure they hadn't changed their methodology and weren't trying to pull a bait and switch. Those looked fine. So it is reducing its emissions. It's doing a pretty good job. Like I said, the city is growing, so overall emissions are maybe not going down as fast as they would hope. Per capita emissions are dropping a lot faster. And then how does Seattle's policy fit into the global context? And it does pretty much follow what the research is saying. The city's reasons for addressing climate change, that it sees co-benefits, also that it feels threatened by potential climate change effects. There was, like I said, a little bit more of an emphasis on adaptation than I was expecting, given that split in the academic world. And then most importantly, does Seattle show that making climate policy at the local level is a good idea? And so what's happening there is there are advantages and there are disadvantages to making climate policy at that level. Cities have some really good advantages. For instance, they can focus really, really down onto a really granular level. They can get all the way down to the level of, say, an individual apartment building, and they can say, we can fast track your permitting if you'll install bike parking and if you'll do these specific efficiency requirements. They also have a lot of experience in a lot of these areas. Cities have been dealing with waste management for hundreds of years. They've, been dealing with building codes and transportation, that kind of thing. There are some disadvantages. For instance, in Seattle, the public transportation is run by the King County. So city can work with King County, but they can't regulate that just on their own. Another really useful thing that they want to do for traffic is road pricing, putting on tolls and that kind of thing. And again, the city can put tolls on city roads, but they can't toll regional roads or interstates or anything like that without permission from the state. So they can't, working just at a local level, they can't do everything that they want to do. They are including in their climate action plan, they are including plans to work with other actors, but they can't do it on their own. And so the significance of this research, cities are making climate policy. Academics have really only been looking at this for about 10 years. There's not a whole lot of research on what's effective, what's been happening, but we need to know because it is happening. And also importantly, it's not happening at the national or international level, at least not in the US. Other countries are doing stuff. Obviously, Kyoto didn't go all that well. And cities, more than half of the world's population lives in cities at this point, and activities, depending on who you ask, activities within city borders are, say, between 60 and 80% of global climate emissions. So if they can make significant reductions, that is a huge chunk of what we're trying to get rid of here. So if they wait for national and international action, we're just going to keep pumping out that 60 to 80%. If cities can move ahead, and if they can use this kind of analysis to understand what works and what doesn't, then we can make a pretty big impact. Cities can also serve as testing grounds for certain policies, and that can then be scaled up to the state, regional, national level without such an investment in resources and time that would otherwise be required. So my conclusion is making climate policy at the city level a good idea. Ideally, what we would have is a global multi-scale approach that would use the strengths and weaknesses or use the strengths of every single level from international, national, state, local, NGOs, neighborhood associations, everybody. And that would really address the problem the way we need to. If that's not going to happen, cities should still definitely be making climate policy. That's still really important, and they should, be adapting to the problems that are going to happen regardless. And then just some ideas for further research. There's not a lot on what cities have actually done. There's not a lot on whether those changes will be lasting. One concern is whether, emissions reductions that cities are claiming are those policies that they would have implemented anyway to, say, reduce traffic, and now they're claiming it for emissions reductions. So you want to make sure that they're lasting, that they're actually significant. And whether, like I was saying, can these policies actually encourage action at a higher level of government? If that scaling up does work, how can we encourage higher levels of government to take advantage of cities as testing grounds for that kind of thing?